Hey y'all, it's Andrew with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans. Today we're going to take you on a walk along St. Charles Avenue. This is the street that's famous for the St. Charles streetcar that runs from the French Quarter to the Garden District. And that's the part that most of our visitors see. And we've actually already done a video that explores that portion of it. But today we're going to take you further along that street, what you'd see if you rode the streetcar beyond the Garden District. And I promise it is worth it. We've got Tulane University and Loyola University. We've got Audubon Park, a lot more beautiful houses in the vein of what you'd see in the Garden District, and plenty more stories that a lot of our visitors never get to hear. So I'll be sharing that as we do the walk, and we're going to do it with 4K video. So get your big screen if you got one, and we're going to do it with surround sound. So your headphones are great for this one too. So drop us a like and a subscribe. Let us know in the comments what you think, and if you'd like to tip your guide, well, you'll find a means to do that down there. All right, here we go. Y'all, we begin at a streetcar stop. Right here is the stop that comes just after the end of the Garden District, which is right back there on the right. We're going to go up beyond it. For a lot of people, the streetcar is the reason that they're aware of St. Charles Avenue, and the streetcar gets particularly thought of as the way to get to the Garden District. But, like I mentioned, lots of other great stuff up here. And even just on the way to the Garden District, I think probably a lot of folks, basically you go through our business district, you get out the other side, pass under a bridge, and you start to see an area that might make you think, did I miss it? Because the portion of St. Charles along the lower Garden District has a few cool old buildings, but a decent amount of dilapidation and some fast food. So easy to think not what one was looking for if the glamour of the Garden District is what you expected. And you kind of get the same thing when you get past the Garden District. I'm not focusing on this place over here as an example of that. This is actually a really nice little restaurant that I would love for y'all to have on your radar, called Delachets. Same name as the street that it's on. They book themselves as a wine bar, but the food is pretty great too. So there's the spot. But as soon as you get across Louisiana Avenue and you're beyond the Garden District, one of the first things you see, at least right now in 2021, is an abandoned drugstore. And it doesn't inspire confidence. But there's a ton of other good stuff to see up here. Just takes going a few more blocks to get past modernity back into the past. I think it's pretty easy too, y'all, to misread the kind of past we have up here. For better or for worse, people think of New Orleans as a getaway town. And so we get a lot of folks who associate us with leisure. And definitely there can be a sort of sleepy, relaxed vibe on streets like this. But that's not entirely how New Orleans is today for people who live here. And it's certainly not how New Orleans was when these things were built. The stuff that you see along St. Charles, by and large, the stuff that dates to the 19th century, was the homes of pretty wealthy people whose business was in the city back behind me, near the French Quarter, but who wanted to live somewhere a bit more secluded than that. So in a way, this is kind of a companion to our tour of the American sector, the business district, because the people's businesses were back there, whereas their homes were up here. And we'll even see a couple that we can actually match up. There are some lodgings in this part of town, and a few restaurants on this stretch, quite a few when you add up the whole row. Superior Grill here, I will give the most credit for their landscaping. Do a nice job. find these painted model streetcars all over town. Lots of different businesses and private homes. The time of year to be. Hello. In a way, too, this story, it's a continuation of the story of the Garden District. If you're familiar with that place, you may know that the Garden District was it was a late addition to New Orleans. New Orleans comes to be in 1718. The Garden District comes to be in the 1830s. And that's because it was a plantation that was sold off. As the city was expanding in population, lots of new Anglo-Americans coming to the city after the Louisiana Purchase. And so with the increase in demand, people sold their plantations, which is what made up this part of town. Lots of classical stuff in this part of the city, but occasional exceptions. Unity Spiritual Center here. This is designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. So the same kind of logic that gives us the Garden District, this expansion of the city with new Anglo arrivals, gradually causes the selling off of more and more of these plantations. St. Charles Avenue was the road that ran through the plantations. It actually goes back, the train track here goes back a mighty long way. The streetcar has been here since 1835. So it actually ran through this land while a lot of it was still plantation. Another food and drink destination for y'all across the way. Columns Hotel over here. Creatively named. It is a hotel, but I think a lot of us think of it as equally a bar and restaurant. Not open just now, but that front porch can be a great place to lounge with something regional, mint julep or a sazerac or something. And the interior is pretty well preserved, so you'd get some atmosphere of what it would have been like to be a guest in one of these homes. But the Columns comes from the 1880s, whereas a lot of the stuff you see a little further back on St. Charles is from a few decades earlier. If that makes a big difference to you, I think to the casual viewer, it's hard to tell them apart. Lots of classical flavor one way or another. Mentioned before that this land was all plantations, and mentioned in other videos too that the plantations were wedges going back from the Mississippi. So all of them touched the river and then retreated. And St. Charles ran through all of them. Because they were all built around the river, St. Charles ended up being shaped like the river. Still a few azaleas hanging on. So St. Charles Avenue is pretty close to mirroring the curve of the Mississippi. And for that reason, it was named Nyad Street when it was first laid out. So the Naiads being the Greek mythical spirits of the river. There's a little bit of poetry there that would have matched up with the forms of the houses. Good morning. Morning.
Good morning.
Children on parade. We're going to preserve their anonymity. So Nyad Street became St. Charles quite some time ago, but you can still feel the steady curve in it as you walk it. Happens actually at really specific points where you'll see a little turn, and that's usually a signal that you're around the border of a plantation. Nice. We are still in spring, y'all. So even this not being the Garden District, at one time, all of this would have been referred to as Garden District without a the, and it is living up to that old name. We've also talked in other videos about the use of St. Charles as Mardi Gras territory. And so as we walk along here, you can see up there, you can see on fences, all kinds of places, evidence of the Mardi Gras parades coming down the street. I'm walking on the side where the parades usually are. They would roll down at where these cars are at this moment. Where I'm walking would be completely full of spectators. So would the middle, the median, what we call the neutral ground. And we're actually very close to the beginning of that section. So the parades begin, depending on which one it is, either around the corner up here on Napoleon Avenue, or a little further up on Magazine Street. And some of them have different routes entirely, so lots of room for variety there, but this is where most of the routes converge. And Napoleon being just a couple blocks ahead of us, you would see beads in the trees on this portion, but not as you get a little further along. For that reason, this is a really fun place to be during the several weeks of parades that we hold every year. But it's also a pretty difficult place to get around that time of the year. So sometimes people show up here during Mardi Gras by surprise. They don't realize that they were committing to a Mardi Gras season trip because they didn't know that there were 3 or 4 weeks of parades each year. And then they get here and they think, well, let's ride the streetcar up and go see one. And the streetcar is out of service during that time because there are people all along the tracks, just as I am now. A bus does run over there, but it has some trouble getting through itself. So best to try and get here via a parallel street. Got here the first of our 2 synagogues on St. Charles. This is Touro Synagogue, named for Judah Touro, who you also see stuff named for him in New York as well. So, huge philanthropist. During his life here, he actually donated to a lot of churches, Christian churches, and after his death, as well as before, endowed various synagogues, some of which conjoined to become the one over there. And he also was responsible for the founding of the Touro Hospital, which is still one of the main ones in this part of the city. So if you get drunk and fall and hurt yourself in the French Quarter, you'll probably end up at a university hospital, LSU or Tulane. But if you get drunk and fall down in this part of the town, well, for one thing, it's a much less popular place to do it. What are you doing? But you'd probably end up at Touro instead. Conveniently right there outside the Garden District. Judah Touro is an interesting example, too, of how New Orleans is, and has for a long time been, about average in the United States in terms of level of Jewish population. And in the South, in that respect, average is pretty above average. So New Orleans is a standout town, and it's the same way that a lot of Northeasterners ended up here looking for their fortune. There was also a Jewish crowd among those people. And that's even though back in the early days of the city under French and Spanish rule, the Catholic Church was the theoretically only available religion. And so there was a requirement, for some reason in the Code Noir, the rules that pertain to how black people could be treated, a requirement that Jewish people be banished from Louisiana. And while that was not ever really a matter of strict enforcement, this shift over to us being the United States, and therefore freedom of religion, made a big difference for those folks. And so you see a spike in arrivals in early 19th century, and if Touro calls itself the first Jewish congregation outside of the original 13 colonies in the United States. I believe I'm phrasing that right. And also, the practice of Jewish exclusion ends up being a kind of common thread through a decent amount of New Orleans history. And because of that, you end up with a disproportionate kind of Jewish philanthropy that's very visible here. So for a lot of New Orleanians, philanthropy takes most of its outlets through Mardi Gras crews, which are a little bit like fraternities and sororities. They're fun, but sort of fun with a purpose is the idea. And they do kind of charitable works throughout the year. They're all different from each other, so how much of that happens is kind of up to each one. But for a long time, Mardi Gras crews were extremely exclusive. And so Jewish people being among the many factors and the many crowds excluded from them found other outlets. So you get more individual philanthropy from Jewish residents of New Orleans that therefore becomes really visible versus the kind of collective philanthropy that happens through Mardi Gras. The Judah Touro is one really notable, maybe the most notable example of that. Saw back on the previous block, Academy of the Sacred Heart, a newer building of theirs. Let's get a little surprise reveal. Voila. So this is one of the prestigious Catholic schools in the neighborhood. You see Sacré-Cœur on the gate. This was a residential site donated to the school, and they kept a fountain back there in the middle, you can see. You can see the "Thank You, Drew" on their fence. And then same thing over here. People are grieving the departure, the retirement, and celebrating the legacy of Drew Brees from the New Orleans Saints. This house y'all might have seen in our Christmas video if you checked that one out. They do some pretty fantastic lighting on their live oaks that time of the year. Yeah, lots of churches in this part of the city, not super frequently visit destinations for travelers, but if you're looking for a place of your particular sect or denomination, then chances are solid. And actually, there's one that I will drop a specific recommendation for. Briefly revisit the subject in Mardi Gras too. Further up ahead towards the end of our route when we get to Audubon Park. From our last video, walking on St. Charles, a few of y'all mentioned that me walking on the streetcar tracks made you nervous. And fair enough, I have never given it, in all the years I've lived here, a moment of serious thought that that's a strange thing to do in other places. And you know, if rails were electrified, or if streetcars were more numerous, faster, quieter, any of that stuff, then yeah, I'm sure people like me who do this would have learned our lesson a long time ago. But as it is, it's a pretty common practice here. We're not seeing a ton of it right now, but runners out here on the tracks, walkers, not an uncommon thing to see. So, something you can do for a thrill of the forbidden if you come from a town with more sophisticated transit than ours. And just make sure you learn what the sound of the streetcar is like, because All they'll do is ding at you. It's a quiet little sound, but you don't want to get hit by one for sure. The one comes now, so we can get that noise. Y'all, this is the largest house on St. Charles Avenue, simply called the Brown House. When you have this much space, you don't need to hog syllables. Passing streetcar friend, that's that sound to watch out for. Another one behind us. That's it. That's what I was hoping for. So the Brown House, story goes that this was built as a wedding promise. And I guess the guy in question didn't have a whole lot going for him. So when he was out a-courting, he offered the woman he proposed to that he would build her the biggest house on St. Charles Avenue. And when she heard that, I don't know what she thought. Maybe she thought, how romantic. Or maybe she thought, sounds like there'll be lots of places to hide. Either way, she said yes. And in she went. That kind of rough-hewn stone style you see there, another thing we see a little bit of in the American sector video, the downtown area. Something we see a lot of up at Tulane University's campus, which we're going to be hitting at the other end of this walk. And it's a style that dates back to a specific architect from New Orleans. Didn't actually do most of his work here, but a guy named Henry Hobson Richardson, one of the great American architects of the 19th century. And he pioneered a style called Richardsonian Romanesque. We only have one design of his, which you can see in that business district American sector video. But lots of other houses built sort of after the fashion of what he did. And it's really common on university campuses all over the place, so Tulane having that is far from unique. Mentioned that these houses are oftentimes companions of specific businesses down in the business district, or at least relate to them at large in an interesting way. So one good example of that, if you had walked through the French Market down in the French Quarter in the late 19th century, then you would have seen a lot of Italian vendors, mostly Sicilian vendors, selling citrus. This was a big movement, late 19th century into early 20th. It was one of various things done as the slave trade ended, as a way of seeking out alternative sources of highly affordable labor. And Sicilians were already accustomed to being fruit cultivators and fruit merchants, and so the transition was a fairly easy one. So Sicilian heritage is a really common thing in Louisiana, Mississippi. Not one of the most famous ones, but very, very common, especially in the suburbs here. So if you've been walking between fruit stands down in the French Quarter, one of them you would have found would have belonged to the Vaccaro brothers. And the Vaccaro brothers were in the business in 1899, when a piece of bad luck came their way, and really in the way of all of New Orleans. There was a big freeze that year, and it killed a lot of the citrus crop. So the Vaccaros went hunting down south of us, went out into the Caribbean, made their way to Honduras, and they bought some citrus there. And as they were there, they also found a huge amount of bananas. Bananas were only just becoming, they're the most eaten fruit in America today by far, but they were just hitting their stride in the US back then. They'd become a popular item via, in the Northeast at least, via the the big Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. We've got magnolias coming into bloom, y'all. That's our state flower right there. A little high up to make out in detail, but they're huge. Hopefully you can get at least a glimpse of white. Here is the place. So the Vaccaro brothers, giving away where the story goes here, they eventually get where they can build this guy. And it's not in the best shape today, but it was reflective of their wealth at one time. So they got into the banana trade, and they did so in part by buying land in Honduras. They found land was extremely cheap there. And labor was pretty cheap too, so they got into the business of cultivating bananas. And after a little while, they were shipping such enormous amounts of bananas and other fruit from Honduras and eventually other parts of Central America into ports in New Orleans that the Vaccaros bought up every ice factory in town so they could refrigerate their fleet of ships. And there was a time too, early 20th century, when you would have seen where once all those Italian fruit vendors had been, the port was now full of Italian workers loading and unloading bananas into warehouses. I mentioned before a movie called Panic in the Streets, and one of many cool things it shows you about the New Orleans of a certain era is those big banana warehouses. And in turn, the Vaccaros end up building the first big pieces of what we think of as modern infrastructure in Honduras, the first railway system, the first mail system, and they essentially become its unofficial, unelected government, and thence the idea of banana republics. More on that later. So, brief pause for one of the coolest libraries anywhere. This is a public library. The family that donated it actually bought it with exactly that purpose in mind. So they got this early 20th century house, fixed it up a bit, and then donated it with the idea that the bottom would stay in its form and still keep its residential design. So basically when you go in, you can go upstairs, find your book in a pretty traditionally library feeling space, and then you can come out and hang out in a very New Orleans residential feeling space in the downstairs. There's big reading rooms, not that big, no, small for reading rooms, big for residential rooms. Or you can hang out here on the green. Beautiful spaces either way, and a great view of everything else all around. So Latter Memorial Library, Latter, and twice a week they do a Friends of the Library book sale right back there in a little detached building. It's a great way to go home with a souvenir. We're starting to get into territory that, depending on what else of ours y'all have seen, you might recognize, because we spent a good bit of time here back during the Mardi Gras season, showing y'all some of the house floats. So we're coming up on a house that was given a Dolly Parton theme back then. So it'll look maybe familiar for some of you, but obviously it doesn't need the float enhancement to be worth the time. So there we go. Yeah, walked right past it. There's our Dolly Parton house. Numerous other possibly familiar ones still to come. We're also getting pretty close to the university portion of the city. Not the universities themselves just yet, but the area very much affected by them. A lot of people living in the area are affiliates. So I feel a little bit of a change of vibe up ahead. A couple of schools first too. So we've got De La Salle up here. A little off to the right at the intersection up ahead is the Newman School. Very, very prestigious private high school. Another result of Jewish philanthropy here. And we also have the Jewish Community Center right up there on the left, the white building. You can kind of think of St. Charles Avenue as split up by all the different stoplights. You get slightly different districts in between them. So we're about to cross Jefferson Avenue, after which things go pretty much pure residential for a while, and it's some of the most impressive houses we've got. Howdy. Got some renovation underway on one of our more modern buildings over here. Comprehensive enough that it looks like a pretty close to a total rebuild. And even though all the attention-hungry truck, even though all the classical styles are pretty varied and there's many different interpretations of them, seeing a modern building once in a while helps remind you how sort of stylistically cohesive all this stuff is. Crossing Jefferson now, that Newman School is out to the right. Lots of famous alumni from there. And in fact, when it comes to variations on classical styles, we've actually got a nice example of that up ahead. So we're about to see a house built in 2018, but you'd hardly know it. So there is a historic district on St. Charles Avenue today, which regulates what can and can't be done with new construction as well as old. And so when a couple wanted to build their own house on St. Charles and tear down an old one to do it, it's going to take some persuasion to make that happen. And a lot of what you got to argue is what you're going to put there in place of it. So this guy is pretty much what you see on other parts of St. Charles, which is creative uses of revival movements. So we've got sort of a Mediterranean style house here. Nice little nod to some of our Spanish heritage, but fairly different from what a Spanish-style house in New Orleans would typically look like. Also, with them being at a corner, they had two different constituencies to please. And so, from what I gather, that was like a 5-year-long design process. And that house, if y'all saw the House Floats video, was where various musicians, lots of local musicians, were built out in either fully 3D form or 2D cutouts. We've got another one coming up, which was turned into a zoo. Oh, and check out, that is the bloomingest jasmine I have seen yet this season. So as I shoot this, it is late spring, which is prime time for exploring this neighborhood. Not too hot yet, at least not by my standards, knowing what summer is like here. I can give you the view, but I can't give you the smell. View is free. Smell will cost you a plane ticket. We're crossing Joseph Street here, so one interesting little exception to how the plantation division process usually went is here. We're in a portion that once in a while you'd still hear called Hurstville, and it was the Hearst Plantation. And the unusual thing about the Hearst Plantation is that the house still exists. Vast majority of cases. So normally, when these families offered up their plantation for sale, they already had a house there. They'd been probably cultivating it for some years, and it's very possible the person living in the house, or people, had been there for most or maybe all of their lives. So, yeah, they might have preferred selling off their land to residents over continuing to farm, but they likely also wanted to continue living where they already were. And so you'd get this neighborhood building up gradually around an old plantation house. And those were not here in St. Charles. They were up against the Mississippi River. For ease of shipping was the idea. So those houses would have been a little ways over here. And they are, in the vast majority of cases, a thing of the past. I only know of two that are still standing. One of them down in the Bywater, and one of them was over there on Joseph Street and now has been moved out to the suburbs quite some time ago. So you can see a plantation house in the city. Neither of those is open for people to visit. Speaking of plantation houses, this one is not a plantation house itself, but it's known for looking a good bit like Tara from Gone with the Wind. Allowed a kind moment of crossing. I wouldn't stop for me right now. Looking dweeby with his backpack on the front of him and a camera out. Please, you can wait. One thing we don't get a lot of in the older parts of the city, y'all, because things are a bit younger here, we get, in sparse numbers, is Victorians. When we do get them, they are every bit as ridiculous as they are anywhere else. Got one here, and then one the next lot down. You know, if the idea of Anglo-American businessmen wanting to move a little away from the city and live somewhere quiet sounds familiar, well, kind of a predecessor to suburbanization. And we get another little taste of that over here. So starting with this house right in front of us, we are looking at the first gated community in New Orleans history. Right between this house and that one, got a path that at one time would have been closed off to the hoi polloi like you and me. Nowadays wide open, but still a private street. And the funny thing about this highly exclusive place is it was named Rosa Park. Total coincidence and accident, but kind of funny. One of the most famous houses on St. Charles, just because it's so over the top, is this one, the Wedding Cake House. And whether or not you saw our Mardi Gras House Floats video, if you saw any coverage of that, just about all of the articles and videos included that house, which was surrounded by dinosaurs. We even have Catholic churches in this part of town. Not that one, that's Presbyterian, but a Catholic church further down the street. I saw a sign for it, reminded me. Oh, also very much a landmark if you're ever here in the month of October. Another one we featured in our House Floats video, and we'll definitely have to visit if we do a Halloween video. Right over there, the house with the Widow's Walk on top. That one we call the Skeleton House. Every Halloween, they have a huge crowd of skeletons in front of it, all in different costumes, all of them holding signs that have some kind of death or bone or otherwise seasonal related pun going on. So if you're a fan of dad jokes and just pageantry, which we are about finding any excuse for, great spot to visit. Gonna cross the road in a second, but y'all deserve a closer look at this business up here. We are all about our live oak trees. No big surprise there. You can tell it's been a dry few days because all of the resurrection fern, all that scruffy stuff on the side, is dried up. It'll come back to life. Not dead, only sleeping. But check this out. This is what we let our live oak trees get away with. Because they are our friends, and because they are not capable of moving, we give them priority over the safety and comfort of human beings. And don't try to sue anybody if you fall on the sidewalks here. Not likely to go well. Just start to get a glimpse of, off in the distance, Loyola University. We've also got, right up there at the corner, Temple Sinai. That is our other synagogue on St. Charles. Mentioned how New Orleans is above average for the South in terms of Jewish population. And funny effect of that is that New Orleans also was the place from which certain records were made. The first Jewish senator who was Jewish at the time when he became a senator, there was another one who renounced the faith. But the first Jewish senator in the United States was from New Orleans, Judah P. Benjamin. And that man also, you have to say this just right, and even then it doesn't quite land it. He's the first person from the United States, do we want to say it that way, who had the first Jewish person from the United States who had a federal cabinet position. And the thing is, he didn't have a cabinet position in the US government. He had one in the Confederate government, and he actually had several. So it's a strange kind of roundabout achievement to have to explain. And since he was a devout defender of slavery, it's often not one that's super eagerly claimed either. So that's Temple Sinai, not associated with Judah P. Benjamin in a direct way. Just thought about him. I can imagine film and TV shooting loves to use these places. One of these, I want to say it's this one. It's featured in a bunch of stuff. Let's see. American Horror Story Coven, there's a party scene at that house, and then Happy Death Day was shot there and at Loyola over here. So this is the beginning of Loyola's campus. This is the more modern side of their campus, but it's in keeping with their theme, which is it's all brick construction. A very cohesive look to the whole thing. We'll get you a proper view, the classic view from the front of campus, but something on this other side of the street right fast. So right across the street from Tulane and Loyola, they're right next to each other, is Audubon Park. And Audubon is an awesome large park that it really took just the right convergence of circumstances to make it happen. And there's a lot to love about it, but one of my favorite things is something you might glimpse right when you first arrive. So you can see this little stone entrance here. What, you might ask, is it an entrance to? The answer, Exposition Boulevard. And that is Exposition Boulevard. I don't know if it's an essential part of the definition, but I think of boulevards as being divided or at least large. And to be fair to this little tiny street, it was much bigger at one point when Audubon Park, all of it, and the zoo beyond it, and this land over here was the site of the 1884 World Cotton Centennial Exposition. So this is kind of a World's Fair type event. It was meant to, as they all are, bring trade people from all over the world and inventors and artists and whatnot, and also to give people a sense of the place where the whole thing is set. So New Orleans wanted to showcase the post-Civil War New South, and it did that by putting a lot of manufacturing and stuff on display, but also a lot to do with cotton, which was very Old South. Quick pause. Here's Loyola, looking at the admissions building over here. That's some graduation photography going on over there. 'Tis the season. And then we've got their main administrative building back there. Got their church over here. It is a Jesuit university. And then the campus continues a good way back behind that one, still with this same look throughout. So the World Cotton Centennial Expo is really the reason why all of these things are here. You have all these fairly tightly packed houses. I mean, they've got space around them, but it's not as though they are extremely far apart, not enough that you could squeeze a university into uptown New Orleans these days. But back when this was a plantation, this was actually two plantations, it ended up going straight into the hands of, well, by a couple of degrees of separation, into the hands of the people who set up the World Cotton Centennial. And then that land was available for big public endeavors like these afterwards. So Audubon Park being one of them, and then the two universities being among them, the Audubon Zoo over on the other side of the park. All of these things, if not for the failure of the World Cotton Centennial Expo, because if it had gone well, it might have been left up for a much longer time. That and other coincidences really led to all of this being possible, and this part of New Orleans might have looked very different if that hadn't happened. Here we have Tulane University. This is the university in New Orleans that attracts the most people from out of town, and it's a good deal larger than Loyola, although it goes back similarly, fairly narrow campus way back in front of me. And they go for a not perfectly cohesive, but fairly consistent Richardsonian Romanesque look. There you go, classic university building flavor. Mention that these things are a vestige, or a legacy, let's call it, sounds a bit more dignified, of that exposition that happened in the park. Another one, so there are others. If you explore the park today, there's a golf course in the middle of Audubon Park, and they have a big chunk of iron ore from the Alabama exhibit. And maybe actually a bigger legacy than this in a way, in terms of just literal big, sheer volume, is a tiny little thing that was brought here by the Japanese delegation. So it's not certain that this was the origin, but the Japanese delegation at that expo handed out these little decorative plants called water hyacinths. And they're, as you receive them, they're small, and they have these pretty blue flowers, and they look like something that you could just drop into the water and it'll take care of itself. It's like getting a succulent. They thrive on neglect. So people received these flowers and they dropped them into the bodies of water near their homes, and, well, just add water was the recipe for infinite water hyacinths. These things exploded into wild growth. They overwhelmed local bodies of water. They spread throughout South Louisiana. They are plentiful enough to drive whole species to extinction, to make fishing impossible in a lot of places, and to actually block the passage of ships. So this was a problem. And federal legislation was seriously considered. And actually the idea that, one idea that took root for a little bit was the idea of bringing in hippos to South Louisiana because they would eat the water hyacinths. And that would possibly solve another problem that the country was facing at the time, which was a meat shortage. So if you could get Americans to adopt hippopotamus meat as a regular part of their diets, then you could kill two birds with one stone. This didn't happen, so if you're wondering if this YouTube video has landed you in a parallel universe, you are not in the reality where the American consumer can go to a grocery store and be sold lake cow bacon, which was one of the ways that they wanted to market that stuff. But came awfully close. Should get a little glimpse of the park from the front. So Ottoman Park is landscaped by the Olmsted firm. This is the same people that did Central Park in New York and lots of other prominent works of landscape architecture, public and private alike, in the US. Frederick Law Olmsted being the better known name from that. So it's a really beautiful and pleasing space just to be in. Lots of the university folks are coming across the street to do some fitness stuff. Plenty of us come in from a little further afield to do the same. Some incredible live oak trees. If you're fond of these guys, then this spot is hard to beat. And it's the home, if you go far enough back, in a little tucked away corner of the tree called the Tree of Life that we showed at the beginning of our Mississippi River bike ride video. Got a pretty little gathering place at the front, so if you just want to come in for a taste, then here's a fantastic spot to linger. Maybe we give this all its own video at some point. Let us know. But if you were to explore a little more, the houses along Exposition Boulevard are actually pretty cool. And there's a more or less circular path that runs through the place. You can see our bikers and runners on that. And I actually would take it, the bike part is one way, so if you're biking, the decision is made for you. But if you're just strolling through, I'd go off that way, because there's a man-made lagoon partway through. Smell the lavender. Flowers just coming into bloom. So this man-made lagoon, while it itself is artificial, it has been really taken to by nature. And the migratory birds that pass through here have gotten to really love taking a break on the little island in that lagoon. So depending on when you pass by, bare minimum, I can promise you ducks. And maybe a couple geese and a swan. But other times, it is covered in all manner of feathered friends. So you have one moment to pause in Audubon Park. That would be my priority. Another gated neighborhood over there. We've got Audubon Place up ahead of us. Still gated. And just beyond it, we're going to see the Tulane President's Mansion. So this is something I alluded to in passing earlier. So this is a house donated to the university by a guy named Samuel Zemery. And he was a big competitor to the Vaccaro brothers. He actually doesn't start off his fruit career in New Orleans. He is a Moldovan immigrant. In a way, a very kind of classic American rags to riches story. He immigrates first to Alabama because he's got family there, and learns that this is really where the fruit business is going down, and he makes his way to New Orleans. So the Vaccaro brothers found what's eventually called Standard Fruit Company. Sam Zemery's company is called Cuyamel Fruit Company, named after one of the places in Honduras where the work happens. And speaking to the idea of banana republics, there's a very banana-friendly president in Honduras during his tenure, and then that guy doesn't get reelected, standard democratic process. Sam Zemery hires mercenaries to just put him back. So democracy is essentially ended in this country for the well-being of the Cuyamel Fruit Company, and in exchange, Sam Zemery gets a huge amount of land given to him by the government, and his operation gets bigger and bigger and bigger and spreads its arms wider and wider. And in Colombia, where it also had a huge presence, the company gets to be known as El Pulpo, which is Spanish for the octopus, evoking exactly that image of never really being able to get away from the thing. And the kind of twist in his story is he decides to retire early, and he sells his operation to a company out of Boston called United Fruit. And United Fruit doesn't pay him in cash, they pay him in stock. And a couple years later, he's not happy with how the operation is going, and he buys a bit more stock, and he has a controlling share. So he takes the whole thing over. So his nickname is the fish that ate the whale, and that's also what a good book about him is called. So while he is not in charge of United Fruit, just to speak to the kind of culture of these fruit industries generally, there's an event in Colombia known as El Masacre de las Bananeras, which is the massacre of the banana growers. And so there's a massive protest for better working conditions by tens of thousands of Colombian workers. And United Fruit manages to leverage with the US government to essentially threaten Colombia with an invasion. And Colombia then, under that pressure, sends its own military, and machine guns get fired into these protesting crowds, and hundreds or thousands of people are killed. And if you've ever read 100 Years of Solitude, it's one of the events talked about in there. And this can be an obscure piece of industrial history for us, but in that part of Colombia, at least around Santa Marta, this is a defining piece of their history that everybody knows. And it's one of the things that informs impressions of the United States to this day. So that was not under Sam Zemery's oversight, but things of a similar character continued with him. There was an election in Guatemala of a president who was in favor of land redistribution to the many, many peasants there, and he convinced the CIA that it was part of it was Soviet-backed, and so got them to go in and create a civil war, which killed, of course, an awful lot of people. And then his ships got used in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The civil war in Guatemala was the kind of genesis story of Che Guevara. So there's a whole lot of legacy behind this stuff in Latin America, to the point where when Sam Zemery died, rebranding was kind of necessary. United Fruit was such a sort of toxic name in some circles by then, and they renamed it after its mascot, Chiquita Banana. I'm not saying it's the same company. I mean, it is. I'm not saying it's the same entity today, you understand. But lines can be drawn. And the other one, Standard Fruit Company, eventually sold, and what they sold to is now called Dole. The other big legacy of this stuff is those docks where massive amounts of bananas used to be shipped from. Used to be that banana ships were the main thing going out of there, but they made a little extra money by allowing passenger space on those ships so people could go and experience the Caribbean for themselves. And that is the genesis of the cruise ship industry, which nowadays that is what those docks tend to be for, is the coming and going of cruise ships. Mentioned we would tie in one more church. So St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church here does something pretty cool every year come Mardi Gras time. So mentioned the parades don't roll this far up, but the Sunday before Mardi Gras, which is a different date every year, Mardi Gras moves around, but the whole last week leading up to Mardi Gras, Wednesday to Tuesday, is pretty much nonstop parades. So the Sunday before Mardi Gras, there's a parade called Thoth, T-H-O-T-H, which is named after the Egyptian god of writing and scribes and knowledge and magic. And it's a lot of people's favorite parade. It's very family friendly. It's a daytime parade. You can kind of come in and get out and enjoy, your favorite one and get going again. And Thoth has a slightly different route from some. So basically, if you walked from here over to Audubon Park, crossed the park and went a little further uptown in the direction that we're facing right now, you'd be at pretty close to the beginning of the Thoth parade route. So on that Sunday, these guys have a Mardi Gras jazz service. And I have to say that carefully just because it's a strange thing. It's a strange concept. A jazz service at one time would have had the same kind of ring to it that, I don't know, calling something a hip-hop church service might have today. I hope those happen, and I'm sure if they do, they're awesome. All I'm saying is really similar types and levels of moral judgment around jazz and hip-hop, each in their own eras. So while jazz and gospel come from really similar sources, if you go back far enough, they diverged a long time ago, and the reunion is overdue. So you can come here and get a jazz service the morning of that Sunday parade, eat some king cake, walk back through the park and get a parade experience. Still have some time after the Thoth parade to take it easy for a little bit before Bacchus, which is the evening parade that day. So just one idea, if you ever end up here during parade season, like I mentioned, it happens to people by surprise, so that would be a Sunday to make the most of and make some really great memories from. Well, I'm a fan of little free libraries, and these guys have a honkin' free library, biggest one I've seen in town. Check that out. And yep, Stephen King, he's in most of them. Some children's books, Animorphs. I read that stuff as a kid, and there's a bunch of them. Man, a lot of YA fiction in here. I need to stop. I'm going to empty that whole thing out. So y'all, if from this area you kept going along St. Charles, the streetcar does continue. It goes across here at Broadway. Broadway leads off to the fraternity corridor for Tulane. I say fraternity because they don't have residential sororities, so that really is frat row first and foremost. And not too far ahead of us, it turns to the right when the street meets up with the river. And the streetcar continues onto Carrollton Avenue, where there's a lot of cool stuff too, but it's not necessarily quite as visually flashy. And it's got its own really separate history. Carrollton was its own city going back to 1833. So maybe we'll explore some of that one day. But for the moment, we wrap things up by the old Loyola Law School campus. And if y'all want to explore this subject matter more deeply, you've got that American Sector tour that you could check out to get more of the business connection. We passed by the United Fruit Building and the cigar factory that belonged to the man who once owned the columns. So if you want to see those things, catch the place where the money was made to stand these things up, that's an option. You've got the long section of St. Charles Avenue back behind us, which you could explore in our other St. Charles video, the part between the Garden District and the Business District, which more visitors to town see than this area up here. Of course, this ties in with the Garden District too, so if you want to learn more about that American history on this side of town, there you go, another option. And of course, made plenty of references to our Mardi Gras house floats video. So checking that one out could give you some of these houses decked out even more extremely than usual, albeit not quite in the spring bloom yet. So for now, y'all, definitely drop us a like if you've taken this long to get all the way to the end of the video. You must have felt pretty all right about it. Subscribe so you'll know when the next of these happen. Comment helps other people find them, even if what you just say is, I don't know, your name and your age or your favorite house or whatever. We'd love to know any of it. And we're going to be dropping more of these soon. Let us know what other cities you'd like to see them in, and chances are we may already have them in one of our channels for our other cities. So if you want to see London, New York, DC, we got separate channels for those. Go check them out. And if y'all would like to tip your guide, you can find the means to do that down in the notes. That's how we operate all of our tours. Free to attend, pay what you will at the end. So if you want to keep that business model going, if you like the sound of that trust-based system, then you can drop some positive reinforcement down below. And thanks so much to y'all who do that. It is life-changing. So you're very kind. Wish y'all an excellent and blooming day. See you next time.